Merci, bonsoir.
Thank you very much. Welcome to this first roundtable for this afternoon. You've heard it. It's called A Global Issue. We'll talk about the Israeli government strategy to oppose the contestation to its policy in the world. I don't know if it's been said this morning, but on Sunday, the 7th of January, the Israeli government has published a blacklist with 20 organizations who will not be able to enter the Israeli territory because they are blamed and accused of taking part in the BDS campaign. 11 of those organizations are European organizations, for example, the AFPS. That is a European organization, but not only. In the United States, Jewish Voice for Peace is also on the list. When I was preparing this roundtable, I found a figure, and Lea Tsemel will correct me if I'm wrong, according to which the response to the BDS movement in Israel was the creation of an organization with 65 million euro in funding, which is something. It will be also very interesting to hear what's happening in the United Kingdom and in the United States. As you all know, the United States being the first support to Israel in the world. The strategy of the Israeli government to oppose the contestation of its strategy in the world, the anti-NGO law, the blacklists, we talk about all that. Lea Tsemel, you will first take the floor. I want to remind you all that you are a lawyer, an Israeli lawyer, defending the Palestinian political prisoners since 1972. You are also a member of the SOS Torture organization. You received the Human Rights Prize in 1996 and a German rights as well in 2004. You will tell us more about the Israeli laws. We know the objective of those laws is to limit the actions of the defend the activists in favor of Palestinian rights. So you have now the floor to explain those laws to us. Thank you.
We don't have nowadays any development of cooperation, ideological cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians. We don't have any strategic cooperation, serious one, between Palestinians and Israelis. And of course, there's no common struggle in what we could call perhaps resistance between Israelis and Palestinians. What do we have? I think that everyone, after so many years, went to something that seemed to be very safe, humanitarian activity. Can you hear me? Humanitarian activity, so to be on the safe side. Many Palestinians, political activists too, opened the safe thing of a human rights association in this or another field, and so did many Israeli activists. And we used to have, I say used to have, I'll explain why, many organizations that deal with many different parts of life, whether it's health or possible, like Gisha, have access to different occupied territories, trying to help in legal things against the prisoners, women prisoners association, etc., etc., etc. Now, there is now a continuous attack on all those civil societies in both sides, Palestinian and Israeli. The Palestinians, of course, are being attacked if Israel can find out or show any contact to what they call an illegal or terrorist organization. And we have known of many, many activities that were cut, totally cut and forbidden. Even the International Women's Day in Jerusalem, they had everything ready, everyone came, food was ready, they forbid it. Activity of culture anything that has to do, or there is any connotation that it has to do with the Palestinian Authority, is totally forbidden in Jerusalem. And as you know very well, also the Israeli organizations are now almost poor, because most of the international money that they depended so much upon was cut. And it was cut partly by the initiative of Israel, that you have to declare where the money comes from, you have to give a very accurate report, and if it's a foreign government, forget it. So we are progressing to minimalizing this activity of human rights organizations on both sides. You spoke a little bit, Shawan spoke a little bit about it. He can, I'm sure, speak much more. Now, we have then a set of laws that were issued easily. The first law, as we call it, the law against the boycott, the BDS law. What does it really say? It does not say, at the end, it went through many stages, but the last stage, that was the last draft of the law, does not say that it is an offense, a criminal offense, to call for a boycott. No. It says like this: whoever in public is publishing a call for boycott on the state, or any institute of its institutes, or any area that is under the control of the state, calling for prevention from economic contact, prevention from social contact or academic contact, and there is a reasonable possibility that this call will be created or came out, and it will bring upon boycott. This is a civil action that can be sentenced by whom? By the person or the factory or the settlement that can be hurt by this call. For instance, if a singer had to come to Israel and there was a contract done between the singer and Israel and somebody called for boycott, then if it was done purposely, as I just described, that person or organization can be sued, and sued for compensation. That's it. This is what the law says, but there are appendixes, not in the law. There is this, they published this list of about existing now 20 organizations that are now forbidden from getting to Israel by principle. It's not everyone, not always, as they say it very clearly. What they declared is that if people are have a major role in such an organization, if they are very active, if they are known to be very active, they will not be able to come in. But then the Minister of Interior has also a possibility to consider whether the person is very important, whether preventing him will cause a bigger damage than letting him in. And there is this Jewish problem. Let me tell you that whoever is a Jew, and he has this inherited right to come to Israel and even become a citizen according to the law of return. Now, what happens if that Jew also calls for a boycott and is also a major member or important member of such an organization, one of those who were declared? So then they say it depends. It depends about what, how, what is the purpose, what is the damage if it doesn't come, what will be the political damage. And I remember now recently, she's not Jewish, but Luisa Morgentini was not allowed in, and she was a member of the European Parliament, and she was very vocal, as whoever knows her knows. And after, I think, a year of trying to pulling all the ropes and trying to get in, she managed, and she visited. So it's still very flexible, but it is an existing threat, as we can realize. Who are those people? As I said, not every member, not anyone who ever signed any petition, no. But it's an activist, they say, who participates in the organization and delegitimizes Israel. Now, we know before this law, without high declarations, the activists of the international solidarity movements were not allowed in. Many people who ever signed on any declaration or any advertisement against Israel were not allowed in. We used to go at the times to the court and ask to enable some of those people to come in. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. I still don't say that it is a final closure of the door, but you should know that it's very risky. Anyway, how does it work? I want to say briefly, because many people ask me, let me say it all together. If someone comes to the airport or to any other probably border passage from the bridge, for instance, they will check if the name is in the list. And if there's no name, they are allowed to do it, and they do it very often. They start to interrogate. Please give me, what is your Facebook number? What is the slogan? Let me open it. They check the telephone with the last calls. Whom did you call? Do you have anyone? Don't you have anyone, etc. And lying is the worst thing, because it gives them an immediate reason to throw you out. Now, if you want to have a fight, to fight it, if you want to fight your way and say, I'm entitled to enter because I have a very important interest, because I do want to check, for instance, what is the situation in the Haitian camp, etc. If you want to go to a legal case about it, you should know that if you are not allowed in, you will be held in the airport. There is a small prison. They don't have very good food, but they have sandwiches. And as long as you can see a lawyer, and the lawyer stops the expulsion for a while until there is a hearing. And in the hearing, they are supposed to bring all the material, why, etc. Again, I say lying in the airport or saying something that can be revealed is very bad. That immediately gives the excuse to say goodbye. But if not, we can launch a nice struggle about it, and especially, of course, if the person happens to be Jewish, then we want equal opportunities to a right-wing settlement supporter to enter, just as well as we want a leftist right to enter. Again, we cannot promise any success anyway, but this is this situation. Talking about laws, there is the other law that also you heard about it, and you heard about it in Israel now more than before, because I don't know if you followed it, but the Polish government wanted to legislate a law that forbids, and it's a criminal offense, if anyone says that the Poles themselves were participating in the Holocaust affairs or supported it. If anyone says so, he is exposed to some imprisonment. And Israel made a whole scandal about it. They didn't win, but they made a scandal. And they forgot that we have also this small law hiding somewhere that says, that the state, you should know, gives some support to theaters, cultural events, etc. And they say that we will not give budgets or support to any institute, Israeli institute, that acts against the principles of the state. And it says, if the organization or the theater piece or the book is denying the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, or if this institution is inciting to racism, a violence or terror. And if that organization or group or body supports armed struggle or terrorist action of enemy state against Israel or other terrorist organization against Israel, and if that group or institution notes the day of the Israeli Day of the Independence as a day of mourning, Nakba in other words, this is also a good reason to cut the funds. And they say, of course, if it acts against the flag, the hymn, or any sign of the state. So it's a law, it's there, and it was activated already against the theater in Haifa, the Arab theater in Haifa, etc. It's a big threat, but we should not forget that it's over there. Besides, there are many strong, and they are getting stronger, and they are getting financed, right-wing initiated organizations like Adkan, that or NGO Monitor, that are following all the NGOs, Israelis and Palestinians, and finding all the sins that they are doing. And recently we were in a very, very big campaign against Ezra Nawi, who is one of the initiators of the IHRA organization that helps peasants in the southern part of Hebron against the settlers, against the tendency to evict them, etc. And Ezra, I must say, is a very, very old client, because had he paid, it would be great for every lawyer, because he has trials again and again and again. But this time, they really exaggerated. They tried to charge him, not to blame him, I would say. At this stage, only blaming that he gave the Palestinian Authority the names of Palestinians who want to sell lands to the Jewish settlements. And therefore, they claim that he endangered those Palestinians. And they are so, that organization, one of them, Adkan, is so eager to defend Palestinians that they couldn't stop from going and filing a complaint. Anyway, the activity was minimalized, and it's a big, big, big shock and damage to the movement of volunteers that want to go and help. Sheikh Jarrah, I'm sure all of you heard about it, about the activity to try and prevent the eviction of Palestinians from houses that used to be Jewish houses in the past in Sheikh Jarrah, not far from around the American Colony Hotel. And there was a very firm activity around it. Now it's after so many detentions and arrests, and every Friday when they have demonstration, they have been attacked. Now there is a real descent of this activity, we must say. It works. And now, did we speak already about the Israeli racism? No, not really. So there are two issues now concerning the Israeli racism. One of them is, of course, the refugees, the African refugees that live in Israel, and they want to throw them away to an African country or wherever. And they have been oppressed for so many years. Now they really want to get rid of them at any price. And surprise, a good surprise, there is a reaction on behalf of the Israelis. Many, many Israelis from all the professions, and I would say most of the society parts, are signing with the name petitions against the deportation. Not only that, there are also some getting organized, people are points to get organized to hide those Africans in the people's houses, and people sign that they are ready to take all the responsibilities. It it brings about the connotation of Poland at the time, those who did hide Jews, but I don't know to what extent. We know very clearly that the punishment that the Israelis who would hide them will receive will not be as harsh as the others. But anyway, this is a good, nice face. We, amongst our friends, usually ask the questions, or we divide people according who would, if necessary, if worse comes to worst, who would hide Palestinians? It's always an echoing question in the background. I don't know. But we do know the other face of racism in the Israeli society is the question of Tamimi. You know the story. I don't have to tell anyone, I'm sure. But what is so disturbing for the Israeli public is that Tamimi doesn't look Palestinian. She doesn't look an Arab. So you know, and redhead, you know that Oren, that used to be the ambassador of Israel to the United Nations or to the States? To the US, or right, came and wrote a whole article that it is only a show-up, and these are actors that are playing the role of a nice American family in the middle of the West Bank. They dress like Americans, they look like Americans, they're not the real thing. But we know that she is the real thing. And it's very difficult for the Israelis to swallow this story. So some very progressive artists said, this is the Palestinian Anne Frank, or this is the real Jeanne d'Arc of the Palestinians, and which, of course, backfired, and some of them had to apologize afterwards. But it exists. These are the different faces of this Israeli society, I would say. Now, I'm about to finish. I just want to say that many people are being searched in their Facebooks, in their media, and are being brought to trial. Palestinians, most young Palestinians, students, in Israel, in the West Bank, in military courts, in civil courts, they are sentenced for likes they did for different information in the Facebook or in the electronic media. Students were sentenced for it. I say it because I mentioned before that once you get to the airport, they would ask you, what is your Facebook? Open your Facebook. Let's see who you are. And we know that there is a very, very deep and probably efficient network of searching who people are. Who are you? What do you think? This thought police. So it is active against those who are there. It is active against those who want to enter Israel, and it's a reason to say no because we found that and that on your Facebook. And my question now is, you kept saying all the time, what we should say, what should we do, right? I think we should do some reciprocity, and it's possible, you know. Every European, or very friendly countries who come to Israel, is being, even if he's not a Muslim, is being searched, asked, interrogated. Not everyone, but many interrogated. Especially if you are a Muslim, you have a Muslim name, you are interrogated, and you are expected to give all the information and to answer all kinds of questions. I did not hear of any Israeli that was ever met in a European airport with, not similar even, some of that procedure. Who are you? Where are you from? Where do you live? You live in the settlement. Or you served in the army for, what, 4 years? You're still in the army. What did you do in the army? Did you pass the international law? Are you a, I don't know, war criminal? Anything, even milder than that. But I think we need some reciprocity. And let's call for it. All right? Good.
Alors la réciprocité, c'est peut-être...
So reciprocity might be a measure that adds up to what we heard this morning when it was suggested that we would ask for the suspension of cooperation agreements between the European Union and Israel. Thank you, Lea Tsemel, for your contribution that shed a light on all the different aspects of the Israeli policies, or at least the aspects that we know a little bit less about in France. And now I will give the floor to Rebecca Vilkomerson. She is the executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace, an American organization. Rebecca Vilkomerson is a member of Jewish Voice for Peace since 2001 and is the executive director since 2009. In 2010, she's been nominated as one of the 50 most influential Jewish American leaders by the Forward, and she has widely published in outlets including the Washington Post, LA Times, Haaretz, and she lived in Israel with her family from 2006 to 2009. So we talked about the United States as an introduction. It's true that the BDS movement has been very vocal. We heard a lot about it across the Atlantic Ocean. As I was saying, the United States is seen as the main support for Israel, and there have been many incidents in various universities which happened in a rather bad context for the opponent to Israeli government. So the government signed an anti-BDS decree saying that all policies, anti-Israeli government policies, are anti-Texan policies as well. So Rebecca Vilkomerson, you will talk to us about the success of the BDS movement in the United States and its force as an opposition, and rather its resistance to the opposition movement launched against the BDS movement, and how you counter it.
Everybody, time slot after lunch, after a very intense morning we had together. But I'm very honored to be here, and I want to bring you warm greetings from Jewish Voice for Peace members and our allies and partners in the United States. And I want to thank very warmly AFPS for inviting me and for making this important conference possible. And I've already learned a lot this morning, which I'll share maybe a little bit of it with you as we're speaking, and maybe afterwards in the discussion. I want to apologize to the interpreters up there who've been doing such a wonderful job. I'm going to go a little bit off script, and thank you all for your patience with the large amount of English that you're having to endure on this panel. So the U.S. has actually been behind, as I'm sure you know, the rest of the world in organizing solidarity with Palestinian rights, but I'm very pleased to be able to report that our movement has been growing strongly in the last several years. And so, as was noted in the introduction, I think, I want to speak to you today about our successes and the factors which I think have led to our growth, as well as the tactics of our opposition, which are becoming more and more desperate as we continue to grow. And I want to start where, and I'm going to butcher people's names, but I want to start where Isabelle Avran and Dominique Vidal left off. Because I think the important thing from my perspective is to focus on this, our responsibility in the face of Israeli impunity, and the need to not feel defensive as we pursue our activities. And we are pursuing our activities based on our principles and on our values, and that gives us the ability to do them with integrity. And I think, so I'm going to focus on the United States political scene. I'm here representing Jewish Voice for Peace, but I'm going to speak mostly more broadly about the movement there. I think I'm very interested in some of the questions that came up this morning that maybe we can talk about more in the discussion, but I'm really going to focus mostly on the U.S. political scene. So I'm sure you already know that the political organizing forces in the U.S. that direct U.S. policy in favor of Israel are enormously strong. And I think of the lobby as being composed of three parts. So the first part is the Jewish identified organizations. It's led by AIPAC. There are many others. That's the equivalent of, I believe, your CRIF. The second part is the Christian evangelical lobby, which actually dwarfs all the others in size, and I think that's very important, especially in the current administration. Mike Pence, as vice president, is making that strength felt, and it's a very important part of the voting electorate. And the third piece is the military-industrial complex. So, of course, Israel gets more military aid than any other country, and the way that military aid is structured, it has to be brought through U.S. military contractors, so they have a profit motive and benefit through that arrangement. So those are what I think of as the three parts of what keeps U.S. policy in place. And historically, the nature of the power of the Israel lobby has been bipartisan in nature. And what that means is that both the Democratic and Republican parties routinely support Israel, almost regardless of its actions. And in fact, the largest recent increase to Israel's military aid package, it's important to remember, and again, already the country that receives the most aid of any in the world, the largest increase just happened towards the end of the Obama administration. So that is something that Democrats and Republicans have equal responsibility for. So the goal that we've set for ourselves in JVP, and also for our partners and allies and other organizations in the United States, is to create a grassroots membership organization that's large enough to overcome the organized forces that maintain U.S. policy in favor of Israel. And given that we have neither the money or the power that can compete with our opposition, we can do that only through building a strong and mobilized and educated base of people. And we take as our inspiration cases like the fight against apartheid in South Africa, like the civil rights movement in the United States, more recently the fight for gay marriage, and the ways that that kind of people power have enabled changes even in the face of a lot of money and power and opposition. And I think especially because we are a Jewish organization, we have a particular role to communicate publicly that the Jewish community does not have one voice on this issue. Somebody maybe said something about the use of the word community. It's a little bit dangerous. But in this case, I'm talking about the word community to say that it's not a true word. It's extremely divided and made up of many parts, as all communities are. It's often easy to use that shorthand. But the Jewish people in the United States are divided, and more people, especially younger people, support Palestinian rights. That is a change that we are absolutely seeing. So I want to just talk about our membership. I'm very proud of it, but also because it's an indicator of the kinds of changes that we are seeing. Jewish Voice for Peace now has over 70 chapters around the country. We have 15,000 dues-paying members. We have over 250,000 people on our supporters list. And combined, we have about 750,000 reach of people on social media. So with that base now that we've been building already over many years, we have set ourselves a goal in the next 5 years of recruiting 5% of the Jewish community as members of JVP in the next 5 years.
How much is it?
That would be 60,000 people. Not so many. We already have 15,000 of them. And the reason we chose that number is because studies of other movements tell us that you need just 2 to 3% of any community, now I feel very self-conscious about saying community, you'll just have to be very patient, 2 to 3% of any particular identified group of people to create a tipping point in the policies. And I think our analysis of US policy is that the Jewish community plays a very particular role in giving permission and enabling US policy to continue as it is. And so if the Jewish community were to flip, that would also potentially, we don't know for sure, but potentially would change US policy. And I want to say that we are an organization that's very proud to be firmly rooted in the left. But ever since we were a very small, locally based organization, and when I started, we had no staff. We met in people's living rooms in the Bay Area. We're a very small organization. But we were clear that we were in this fight not just to be right, but because we have a responsibility to do our absolute best to win. And so we are in it to win it. And in this case, winning means broadening our movement and moving the mainstream towards us. And I think that's very important. So we do that by holding on to our values and principles. And one thing I'm very proud of is that even as we've grown bigger, we've only grown bolder. And being compelling enough by telling good stories, by enabling people to say the things that are true about their lives, by creating communities for people that they want to be parts of, we're compelling enough that more and more people come to us rather than us compromising our positions to bring them in. So that's a very important point. And we had been practicing BDS, doing BDS campaigns on the occupation for actually since before the BDS call, since 2004, we started doing shareholder activism against Caterpillar, and we were working in cooperation with the BDS movement, but we finally endorsed the full call for BDS in 2015, which is a very important move for us at that time. So we build our membership through educational events, by work in the media, of course, both traditional media and new media, probably most importantly, by running local and national BDS campaigns, by developing relationships with our congressional representatives, and by offering, as I was saying, a communal and spiritual home to those of us who need and want one. Not everyone does, but many people, Jewish people in particular, it's very difficult to turn against. Often people have to maybe not entirely leave, that's too dramatic, but you have to go against your families, your teachers, your rabbis, your siblings, your friends, in order to speak out on this issue. And so we need to offer people a place to come where they can feel fully Jewish while also being fully in their politics. But no matter what we are doing, we are always thinking about organizing, no matter what activity we're pursuing. How do we bring new members in? How do we get them more involved? And then more involved? How do we make them become leaders? It's slow and hard work, and there are no shortcuts to it. And we believe it's the single most important thing we can do, if we care, which we do very, very much, about actually doing our part to bring about freedom and equality to all people in Israel and Palestine. And the other thing I wanted to say is that we do work strongly in partnership with communities and organizations that are necessary to be part of a broad movement on behalf of Palestinian rights. We do that, of course, because it's the right thing to do, but also because we understand that in order to win this fight, we need a broad cross-section of people of color, of women, of young people who are all committed to this struggle, as well as the ones that affect their own lives and communities. So that means we have to do our work under a very strong anti-racist framework. And I think we already strive to do that, but it's become more and more important in the last number of years. And we know that it's in fact the very similarities that can be drawn between the struggles at home that our allies and our partners are working on and what's happening in Israel-Palestine that's at the root of the increasing awareness and solidarity that we're finding and that we're helping to build. So what that means in practical terms is that we work strongly with Muslim partners against the terrible Islamophobia in the United States. We're building new partnerships with African Americans, with Latinx, which is Spanish-speaking communities in the United States, with indigenous peoples in the United States. In particular, we're doing that through our Deadly Exchange campaign, which is working to end police exchanges between the US and Israel, where these exchanges are of the worst policing practice, worst racist policing practices that are shared between representatives of the two countries, and which affect, of course, Palestinians in Israel-Palestine and all communities of color in the United States in particular. And again, that's not easy work, and it doesn't go quickly, and it entails showing up for those other groups in a very serious way over the long term, in the hopes that they will also show up for us and to build that sense of common purpose and common solidarity. We're drawing particular attention to police exchange programs that are being run by organizations like the ADL. The ADL is the Anti-Defamation League. It's mostly known in the United States for its work against anti-Semitism, and it's known as a civil rights organization, but it actually has a long and sordid history of organizing against Arab communities in the United States and of using its power to repress and suppress any organizing that would undercut Israeli strength. So the ADL leads some of these police exchanges, and we feel that as a Jewish organization that we have a particular role in calling out other Jewish institutions that are contributing to protecting Israel, and we want, as we do that, to promote understandings of that. The ADL is promoting an understanding of safety and of security, and we talked a bit about this morning, I think, but the understandings of safety that are promoted through these police exchange actually exclude Palestinians, it excludes black people, it excludes Muslim people and other people of color, and we want to create a new vision of what safety is that includes all people. So that is part of the sort of narrative thrust of our campaign, but we're also trying to actually end these exchanges themselves. So of course in the last year, since Trump became president, it's been a horrifying time in endless ways, actually. But it also presents some opportunities, I think. And in particular, Trump's unilateral declaration on Jerusalem, as well, of course, that the fact that his administration is represented in terms of Middle East policy by ambassadors and point people like David Friedman and Jared Kushner, who are settlement funders or in some cases have lived in settlements. Again, Mike Pence, who is a Christian Zionist whose support for Israel is based on an apocalyptic and frankly anti-Semitic vision of the end of days. So that's finally, I think, broken the idea that the U.S. can play a role as an honest broker, which has long been a myth that has been part of the U.S. role in Israel-Palestine, and was always seen as this potential honest broker, despite the fact that we offer virtually unconditional military, economic, and diplomatic support to Israel. So, you know, I think we're depending much more on you also for leadership from Europe now that we are in the situation that we're in under the Trump administration. But the thing that's interesting about what's happening now is that the polls are reflecting the impact of the Trump administration, I think in a way that's actually quite positive, or will be if we get through the Trump administration, which I suppose is a big if. But the polls do reflect that. The very respected Pew poll, which came out just a week or two ago, shows that there's now a growing divide between Republicans and Democrats and their views of Israel. So 79% of Republicans now sympathize more with Israel, but only 27% of Democrats. So if you remember earlier, I was talking about it being a bipartisan issue. You can see that it's now very, very much divided. So those statistics don't help us much in the current political moment, I'm afraid, but I do think it's an encouraging sign for the slightly long term. And Trump, by allying himself so closely with Israeli government interests, I think, if I can say it in a very American way, is in effect ruining Israel's brand. So you have many liberal Americans who otherwise would have supported, for example, Obama when he increased military aid to Israel, now are maybe questioning, because of the way that Trump is treating Israel and the way he's connected to the other issues and the way he's approaching them, now have some concerns about supporting Israel in that same way. So in terms of a recent success that we're having and the way we're building, I wanted to spend just a moment talking about a bill that's going through Congress right now called No Way to Treat a Child. Two very wonderful organizations that are allies of ours, the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization, and Defense for Children International Palestine, have been pushing and working on this bill now for several years. And they have a US congressperson who's a sponsor, and we are a very proud supporter. And this bill proposes that no U.S. military aid should be used to imprison children. And while the bill is limited in scope, it does in fact address the S in BDS. It's a sanctions bill because it says that government assistance should be limited based on the conditions being used of the Israeli army and the way it's treating Palestinian children. And I do want to say that even a couple of years ago, this bill could hardly have been imagined. It has actually attracted more than double the number of legislative sponsors than they originally intended. We have 22 legislators who are signed on, and that's a reflection of the organizing that I was talking about at the beginning of this talk, where we reach out to constituents in these legislators' home districts, and we let them know that their constituency supports this bill and it's safe for them to support this bill. It used to be that the Israeli lobby would harshly punish any lawmaker that stepped out beyond its agenda, and now we actually have a small but significant number of legislators who are outright opposing the lobby and speaking out for Palestinian rights. So that's a very, very significant shift. One thing I've learned from this visit here is that while we in the US don't enjoy the levels of political support that Palestinian rights do in many European countries, we're also not facing the same level of oppression and repression as you all are here in France, also in Germany, and I think maybe to a certain extent the UK. And so it's interesting to think about why that may be, and it might be a good thing for us to talk about later. But I did want to talk a little bit about the opposition we face in the US, because there's a very well-funded network of think tanks, of advocacy groups, of lawfare proponents who use the law to attack BDS, to attack student organizations, to attack professors who speak out, public relations firms. They're often funded directly or indirectly by Israel itself. We know that Israel is spending tens of millions of dollars to delegitimize the BDS movement. And the combination of all those actions are to defame and to intimidate and to bully and punish those that advocate Palestinian rights. So that ranges from websites like the Canary Mission, which catalogs student activists in hopes that they will be threatened and not be able to find employment after they leave school, and discourage their activism. To blacklists of professors, to posters calling students and professors, usually students and professors of color, terrorists, to co-opting language. Just yesterday, Frank Luntz did a presentation, somebody stuck in, and he was talking about the ways to co-opt the language of peace to undermine BDS. And finally, to passing laws in 23 states now, and counting, that punish BDS activists. So all those types of activities and more are cataloged in a report by an organization called Palestine Legal. It's called the Palestine Exception. I encourage people to look at it online. It's already a couple of years old, but it's a very useful guide to the tools and tactics of the opposition and the impact of the opposition. But what I want to leave you with is that we are continuing to fight back. Just this past week, a coalition of organizations, including JVP, defeated an attempt in Massachusetts to pass an anti-boycott law. We're trying to stop calling them anti-boycott laws and starting to call them repression laws. But every time we win one of those fights, legislators learn that unconditionally supporting Israel, which used to be a political no-brainer, now has a cost, and that is very important. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Organization, which is a very storied free speech organization, has taken a very strong stand against these bills around the states. Just a few weeks ago, they won their first case that they brought against one of these laws in Kansas, where it was found to be unconstitutional, which should be obvious, but there will be many more fights to come because of our system of government. It will have to be fought state to state before it gets to a federal level. But by so egregiously attempting to carve out an exemption from free speech and human rights standards for Israel, more and more people with liberal and progressive values in the United States have their eyes open about the fundamental damage that is being imposed in the name of Israel and Jews the world over. And I think that's a very important frame, because I think so often people say, oh, you're making an exception, you're criticizing Israel more than other countries. No, actually, our opposition is making the exception for Israel. They're asking us to treat Israel as different from any other country in the world. So there's much more to speak about. That I would love to, but I'm going to close there. And I do want to end, I think, on a last hopeful note, which is that JVP and the AFPS and Palestine Solidarity Committee from the UK, which we're going to hear from in a minute from Hugh, we're all among the organizations that have been announced as part of Israel's travel ban on those who support boycott. And I think that clearly there's nothing that scares Israel more than the growing global wave of support. And we know, and we must remind ourselves, and we can do that by being together, that they can't bully or intimidate us out of speaking out. And I want to admit that in the last several months, I've felt the intensity of being a target, but being here has been a very important balm for me to that feeling of isolation and attack. And I think now more than ever, we should understand this move as an opportunity, just like all these other opportunities being handed to us, and that today is really a first step toward it as we build our unity and strength together to fight Israeli apartheid and build a future based on freedom and equality for all people. Thank you.
Merci Rebecca Vilkomerson. Alors il sera.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. It will be very interesting to know whether there are differences or similarities with the situation in the UK. And now I will be giving the floor to Hugh Lanning, Chair of Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the United Kingdom. He has been chair of the PSC for 10 years now. And he was one of the first people to be banned from entry in Israel in accordance with the law that was adopted in Israel, the anti-BDS law. And, of course, Hugh Lanning was at the head of the greatest trade union for 30 years. He was in charge of the pro-Palestinian campaign in this regard. He is the chair of the Campaign for Freedom of Movement, and he's also vocal for United Against Fascism. And you have the floor, Mr. Human. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your hospitality. I am sorry, but that is all I will be saying in French today.
I bring solidarity and greetings from one banned BDS organization to another banned BDS organization. Well done and congratulations. I was asked to talk in English about our challenges in the UK, the IHRA definition, which I'll come to, attacks on free speech, the undermining of municipalities' right to invest ethically, the role of government and the Labour Party, and the BDS ban. I'm not going to be able to cover all of that, and I don't claim to have all of the answers, but I'm going to try and share some of our experiences, some of the things, like Rebecca has been talking about, that we think have gone quite well. But I want to just set out, if you like, to begin with, in my experience, 5 principles that we've followed that we think we should use to face the challenges. And they're quite simple ones, really. It's firstly, speak truth to power, to be anti-racist, to build alliances, to talk about Palestine, and to base our case on equality, international law, and human rights. And I'll try and give examples on each of those. And I'm going to try and be positive. I heard your discussion about winners and losers. In the UK, it would be, is the glass half full or half empty? I'm always on the more positive side. I tend to take the view that we must be doing something right if they're taking so much effort to ban us, stop us, and prevent us doing things. If we were ineffective, they would leave us alone. So I think we should take courage, if you like. By the more they react, the more I think we're on the right track. Just in terms of background before going on to those 5 principles, if you're an Israeli, it must feel like you've had 70 years of constant progress. In Palestine, it must be one of ongoing catastrophe. Israel is imposing a system of apartheid as we speak, systematically oppressing Palestinians in Jerusalem, the West Bank, in Gaza, but also as refugees. And I've just finished my first essay as a student again after 40 years. I'm a master's student again, and I did it on apartheid in Palestine. And you see, they discriminate in every single area. Environmentally, it's through waste, water, it's land. They control health, homes, work and travel. And they operate different laws and education systems, and they kill, maim, and imprison with impunity. And I think one of our challenges as the Solidarity Movement is to get a serious public discussion about Israel as an apartheid state. I think that is a tipping point, that if we can get that framing of the discussion, it will make all of the other arguments we have around BDS and what we should do more legitimate to go forward. And I think that regime which they're building is not sustainable or defendable. It's Israel's strategy, therefore, to divert everyone's attention from the reality of what's going on. They want to demonize all the opponents and opposition. It doesn't want world attention focused on its actions and on its behavior. And that's why Israel is spending millions of, well, I put pounds originally, then I changed it to euros, but I expect it's shekels that they're actually spending, putting huge resources into undermining its critics, and it's doing everywhere. But the US, Europe and the UK are its main targets, and Israel, I think, is aware that if it loses the argument in those areas which are its traditional friends, it will in the long term lose politically. And I suppose the intro point I want to make is that the good news, I think, is that they are already losing. Despite those huge endeavours, the political and public support for Palestine continues to grow. And in the UK, we did some opinion polling of the public during our last general election in 2017. And there was majority support for Palestine in every category, every age category. And amongst young people, it was 4-1 in favour of Palestine. And I think because they, the next generation, they don't see today's events through history. They actually see the reality of what's going on. They might see it on telly, on the TV, but more often they see it through social media. The attacks on Gaza, on the wall, the imprisonment of Lea Tsemel, all of these are real events that they see and they judge Israel on now. And I think the next generation are our target for what we need to be doing. So coming back to the 5 principles, speak truth to power. One of our views is that the best way to defend a freedom is to exercise it. You won't defend freedom of expression by keeping quiet. You need to make as much noise as you possibly can. And when government announce policies, they issue regulations and statements. They want to do, as the Americans would say in Vietnam, shock and awe. They want a chilling effect. That means that any response or discouragement, they'll discourage any response or challenge. So as a solidarity movement, one of our duties and responsibilities is to stand up and speak truth to power. In the UK, unlike the Republic of France and the United States, we have no written constitution. We have no statutory right to freedom of speech as individuals or as organisations. Perhaps ironically, at the moment, we rely on the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 10.2 that was quoted this morning, about the protection of freedom of expression. So it was in that context that the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition on anti-Semitism, was promoted in the UK. And it was promoted heavily by supporters of Israel. And the government, and I'll come to it, but the government adopted that definition, not just the narrow definition, but all the examples given by the IHRA were cited by the government as examples of anti-Semitism. And the clear intention was not to use that definition to actually fight real cases of anti-Semitism. It's never been used in that context at all. Rather, it was to use to attack Israel's critic. And as you were talking about this morning, that is to conflate such criticism as anti-Semitic and to use it, as they did, to try and cancel meetings, ban speakers, and intimidate supporters of BDS. And if you want, I can give you the reference to a website where these are detailed, where those attacks took place. But that definition was promoted in Parliament and in the press, and at the same time there are a whole lot of accusations going on about anti-Semitism in the British Labour Party. But contrary to what was said in the press, there was no law passed, there was no statutory change, it was just simply a statement of government policy. It doesn't override any existing statutory duties or responsibilities, such as protecting the freedom of expression. So, notwithstanding that, it was instantly by the supporters of Israel, being quoted to universities, quoted to municipalities, other bodies, as if it was the law. They were pretending it was the law, and they were trying very hard to get meetings and speakers banned. We do have a law in the UK which is called incitement to racial hatred, and that is already there to challenge where there is racism of any shape or form. It's our view that it's not the law that's the problem in the UK or elsewhere. Actually, in terms of the rise of racism, we think there is a rise in racism because it's being accepted as a legitimate argument by mainstream political parties. And we had it in the referendum in the UK about leaving Europe, where you got serious, allegedly mainstream politicians getting up using racist arguments to support their case. That is why we have a problem around the UK and Europe about the rise of racism, not because us put forward BDS or any of the other excuses that are there. So we did many things to try and challenge the application of the definition, but it was asked about this morning. I think probably the single most significant thing we did, in conjunction with supportive Jewish organisations, not by ourselves, we went with Jewish organisations as well, was commission legal opinion at the highest level about the legal status and standing of that definition. In particular, because they kept on getting raised, we asked whether activities such as describing Israel as an apartheid state or describing it as practicing settler colonialism or calling for policies of boycott, divestment or sanctions against Israel, could such things be described or characterised as anti-Semitic? And the legal opinion, and this was, a very, very senior counsel in the UK, came back and said very clearly, if a public authority which sought to apply that definition to prohibit or sanction such activities, it itself would be acting unlawfully. Because even the IHRA definition says there has to be hatred of Jews that is driving the action. It's not the action itself that is the requirement for the law. And we launched this advice in Parliament. We sent it to every municipality, every university, gave it to supporters in every party. And the intention, and I heard it being said this morning, was to make it clear to those who would listen, which wasn't everyone, that there is a legitimate alternative view to the one that the government put forward. And to those who wouldn't listen, we were saying that there was a risk of legal action if they proceeded to follow the IHRA definition. And at the same time of this, the other example of sort of lawfare, if you like, the British government made an announcement that it was going to try and stop municipalities in the UK following ethical investment policies that included Israel. And they made a press announcement that they were going to do that in Israel. Fine place to talk about British pensions law, but they made that announcement there. And what they said in their press release was that town hall boycotts of Israel undermine good community relations, poisoning and polarising debate, weakening integration and fuelling anti-Semitism. And this was said alongside statements by members of the government condemning BDS as anti-Semitic. And there was clearly a concerted plan. If you take the definition, the action against municipalities and on BDS to try and, if you like, intimidate campaigners for Palestine. And in all of this, no other boycott of any other country was being talked about. It wasn't a general challenge to racism or anti-Semitism. It was a campaign against supporters of Palestine. That was what was going on at the time. And it was as if, well, it is the case, that Israel had briefed the British government, and the British government was firing Israel's ammunition at Palestine supporters. So our response to that was that we raised about 150,000 euros in 3 weeks to challenge the government in court. And we took that to the High Court in the United Kingdom. And the court decided that the government did not have the power to issue such regulations, and they couldn't force the change of the pensions law of the municipality without a change in general law in the UK as a whole. And I'm not quoting those two examples to say that law is always the answer. It's very expensive and you can lose. But the point of both of these examples was, one, to show to the government that we were prepared to challenge them, and particularly to challenge their authority to use powers that they didn't have. But also it was to our supporters to show that these things can be challenged. Just because a government says it's so, it isn't necessarily so, and we have the ability to fight back and sometimes to win. And so that was, if you like, examples of why it's so important for solidarity organisations to put their heads above the parapet and challenge what's going on. The other principles I'll go on at less length, but the second one was about being anti-racist in thought, action and deed. And we were founded in 1981 as an organisation, and right from the beginning it was in our rules that we opposed racism, and specifically that we were opposed to Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But we looked at the whole issue again about 10 years ago, and we recognised there are people who are anti-Semitic. There are people who hate Jews. Not in our organisation, not any longer in our organisation, and as has been mentioned, there are Christian evangelists who support Israel, but are fundamentally opposed to Judaism. And so we recognise it's relatively easy to say we don't like these extremists, but what's more important is to realise that to be anti-racist is not an option, it's not a choice. It's got to be a fundamental building block of us as a movement and as an organisation. And it's not just because it's right. It also makes us stronger. But in fact, it's Israel's weak point. Israel is fundamentally a racist state. And it's building an ever more, as I described, all-encompassing apartheid regime. So to be anti-racist in everything we say and do is a strength, but also it does mean we have to be vigilant. We've had to expel and suspend members from our own organisation because of what they've said and because of what they've done, issue guidance and advice, because our view is to do nothing, to be inactive is not an option, and it weakens us. The third principle is building alliances. It's about activity, action, and as Rebecca has been mentioning, organising. And alliance building is central to our strategy. Although it's fun, we're not going to win as a passionate, dedicated minority. If you like, for the South Africa anti-apartheid movement, it took 40 years from when it launched the boycott campaign until Mandela walked free. And with hindsight, we think that all happened very quickly, but it was a very long, protracted struggle. And many years ago, when I was a lot younger and had a different colour hair, I was active in the British trade union movement as a senior official. And at that time, essentially, the British trade union movement supported Israel. It occasionally mentioned Palestine and saying, wasn't it a shame? But it did nothing about Palestine. And it was many years hard work, but now there is a consensus in the British TUC to support Palestine. And we did that by using our strength. Our strength was committed supporters who are also trade unionists. But we also won the hearts of trade union leaders. We took trade union leaders to Palestine, and when they came back, they do what all good trade union leaders do. They talked, and they talked, and they talked, but they talked about Palestine. They talked about what they had seen, and they talked to their organisations, and they changed their organisations to come to support Palestine rather than have a balanced or neutral position. So in that context, our next target, which I mentioned, is young people. I've already referred to the Labour Party, and in recent years, some of you might have known, a lot of people have young people have joined the Labour Party. Many of them allegedly to support Jeremy Corbyn, but in fact, a lot of them also support Palestine. And we're currently talking to leading supporters of Palestine within the Labour Party to establish a grassroots organisation within the party to capture that and mobilise that support. And so organising for us is not talking to ourselves. It's actually about finding new audiences. It's about talking to people who we're not talking to. And social media has been mentioned. During the onslaught on Gaza in 2014, and previous ones, but particularly in 2014, we had hundreds of thousands for weeks who were prepared to march on the streets of London in protest about what was going on in Gaza. And that was because millions of young people saw what was going on through social media, and they were prepared to come out on the streets as a consequence of that. And that resulted in our biggest growth. I mean, those campaigns resulted in the biggest growth in the solidarity movement. We've doubled in size, money, income, and so on over the last 5 years. And our challenge is to harness that support and that next generation to be the future of the solidarity movement. And although there are problems with the use of social media, I don't think we should be frightened about it, because Israel has a problem. It hasn't got a good story to tell on social media. It can attack us, it can challenge us, but when it comes to saying what it's doing, it hasn't got a message that is capturing the hearts and minds of young people today. And that's a real strength that we need to focus on. The fourth point I want to mention is talking about Palestine loud and proud, and amplify and promote the Palestinian voice. And it's good today that you're focusing on what you should do, but I get complaints of meetings in the UK, gentle ones from Palestinians saying it's a very good meeting, and we've heard lots of non-Palestinians talking about what Palestine should do, and when are we going to hear from the Palestinians? And so the role, I think, of the solidarity organisations is always to promote the Palestinian voice, not to supplant the Palestinian voice, and to make sure there is a space for Palestine to tell its own story, not for us to take it away from them. We had that challenge. It's been mentioned already, the Balfour Declaration. Apologies. 2017, 100 years ago, Britain gave away something it didn't own. It gave away Palestine. And in 2017, the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, and Israel wanted to celebrate that in London, come to London and make it a big cause of celebration. And we had lots of discussions. Should we demand an apology? Should we petition against Balfour? Should we just have protests about the celebration? But in discussion with the Palestinian organisations, we said that this was an opportunity for us to focus on the Palestinian story. And during the course of last year, we had hundreds of meetings, film shows, talks by Palestinians of what had gone on and what the history was. And they were literally hundreds, and the culmination of this was a large demonstration of over 15,000 people in London on the anniversary of Balfour. And the point was, we weren't protesting against what Israel had done. We were talking about Palestine positively, about justice for Palestine now. And as a consequence, all of the media talks that took place around Balfour always asked the question, what about Palestine? What about Palestine? And it ceased to be the celebration that Israel was hoping for, and actually it threw in to highlight actually the injustice that was still there and still going on. And that reaffirms to me that Israel doesn't want to talk about Palestine or what it is doing to Palestinians. Israel wants to talk about anti-Semitism, terrorism, BDS and Syria. Anything but Palestine is what Israel wants to talk about. So our job is to be loud and proud and amplify the Palestinian voice. And when I was able to visit Palestine, I remember being told frequently by Palestinians saying, it's really great you've come here, you've heard our story, but what really counts is what you do in your own country to build support for Palestine. And I think we should always focus on that as our focus. The last of the principles was equality, international law, and human rights. And clearly, you can't talk about Palestine. History is important. 100 years since Balfour, 70 years since the Nakba, 50 years of occupation and 10 years of siege. And these are all important dates and anniversaries for us to use and campaign around. But unfortunately, we haven't got a time machine. We're not going to be able to rewrite history. We're not going to be able to change things. We can learn from it. But actually, our job is the future. What we're trying to do is change the future and make the future better and different. And so for every historical wrong, I think we need to have a future action, and we need to build broad-based support, and I heard you talking about that, and we're not going to mobilise that or do that just by mobilising those people who already support us. So in arguing for our case, we think we need to keep very focused on the global standards of equality, international law and human rights, because it's those that we think we can draw in the biggest range of support to support the case. And also it's the last place where Israel wants us to go, because Israel appeals to history because it doesn't want to be judged by modern standards. It wants a historical debate to take the focus away from its actions today. And so our challenge, I think, is always to keep on bringing it back to today, to bring it back to Israel's daily inhuman acts that are unjustifiable. And so you'll be pleased to hear in conclusion that I just want to refer to the BDS ban. And we have 4 elements of our strategy: solidarity, political action, organising and campaigning, of which BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, is the key element. And I've mentioned Palestinians living under an apartheid regime, and the world's been complicit with that oppression by Israel. And I think it's our responsibility to put it right as a generation until Palestine's not living under military occupation. So in that context, what is so outrageous about the call for a solidarity movement for boycott, divestments and sanctions until Israel complies with international law? It seems to me that if we're not doing that, what Israel is demanding that the world accepts is that we should say it doesn't have to comply with international law. It has immunity, it can do what it likes, and the rest of the world would do nothing. And banning critics and supporters of BDS is not going to silence the opposition, in my view. Rather, it exposes Israel's false claims of democracy. I think it shows how isolated Israel has become and how far removed it is from any normal understanding of democracy. Freedom of expression is a prerequisite of any democracy. Therefore, there must be a right to disagree as well as agree. And if your best friend on the planet is Trump, I'd be very, very careful if I was you. But barring people from Israel who follow the call for BDS is not going to weaken the solidarity movement. I think rather the reverse. I think it proves our point that Israel is not and cannot be a democracy until there is justice for Palestine. As has been mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be one of the first people barred by Israel under the ban. And just in case you go, to let you know they haven't got a sense of humour, the Israeli security forces. Certainly not a British one, anyway. But PSC, like AFPS, are in that top 20 of banned organisations. And as I said at the beginning, I think it means we're doing something right. For us, we're going to continue to challenge Israel's inhuman acts and stand up for those who seek to silence us. Thank you for your time, your patience. Apologies for the English, but it was a great opportunity to share our experience with you. I hope it's been useful. Thank you very much.
Merci, Hugh Lanning.
Thank you, Hugh Lanning. So it's already 4:04, so we can start and open the floor to hear your questions. But before that, Lea Tsemel wanted to add something.
I apologize, but all of a sudden the thought came to me that spy or messenger from the foreign Israeli ministry that is sitting here will go back to the one who sent him and will say, you see, she did not remind one word about the situation of foreigners in the West Bank. So we can go on with our policy. So I cannot not let it happen. You should know, in brief I say, mixed couples of Palestinians and foreigners are having now a new campaign against them. The Israelis are launching a campaign by preventing the realization of such marriages and parenthood and trying to demand from every foreigner who got married with a Palestinian, whether a woman or a man, to resign from any job they have, to come in with a very limited visas of 1 month, to pay about 80 to 50,000 shekels when they want to come to enter, and then get it back when they go out, in order to assure their exit. And I think the purpose is to encourage those families to immigrate. They don't want foreigners inside. They don't want those important witnesses to the policy. So I said it, okay? Sorry.
Alors peut-être des questions maintenant.
So we'll have the floor now. We can have a discussion for about 10 minutes. Do you have any questions?
On va peut-être prendre 2 questions.
So we'll start with 2 or 3 questions. As I cannot hear, no, we cannot hear the question if they do not speak in the mic. So we cannot interpret. I'm sorry, we can't interpret if they do not speak in the mic. Can you ask someone to repeat the question, or maybe? And so we can't. We can translate. So it's a question about the Balfour Declaration. Yes. Good morning. So a comment for Mr. Lanning about the Balfour Declaration. I just wanted to remind everybody that this says that the right to create a Jewish home in Palestine, we do not talk about Israel but Palestine, should not prevent the rights of the non-Jewish population living locally. That was part of the Balfour Declaration. So that was just a comment. There were no questions, right? No, there were no questions.
Hugh, you told us that one of the principles or the must of this movement is to try to find new audiences and try to work with youth. I would like to tell us how that happened with American and English youth, because here in France, we are trying to make it, but it's a very huge challenge for us. So specifically, how did you start to work with youth in colleges and in universities? How did you make the first step, which is for us kind of complicated with public education? And what are the challenges, and what are the challenges to do that? And how specifically you talk, or did you talk to the youth so they can understand such a complex subject in a certain way? How did you make it easy and comprehensible for them?
Donc voilà, comment atteindre les jeunes?
So how can we reach the youth, and what are the challenges?
Dernière question ou demande de...
So last question. So we heard you telling us about the situation in the UK. I think that the situation in France is really different for many reasons, but also because of the relations with trade unions and political parties in France. It's not the same context at all in France. But I think that despite of that, we can learn a lot from your experience, because we are trying to put at the heart of the political debate the question of sanctions, the questions of criticizing the Israeli policies, policies that we are supporting at the moment and that we are trying to counter with the BDS campaign. So thank you, Hugh, if you can give us some elements on that.
Peut-être qu'on vous laisse répondre et puis on reprend deux autres.
So you can answer and then we'll take 2 more questions.
Hugh Lanning.
Okay. On the first question or point about Balfour, we were very conscious that the part of the Balfour Declaration which said the creation of the State of Israel or Israel should not be at the expense of the Palestinian people. And that was one of the themes that had been ignored since that time, and telling, if you like, that there was an injustice that had to be put right was one of the messages that we sought to get across. But we were also trying to get across that the British were partly responsible. This wasn't something that had happened over there that was being done by Israelis and Palestinians against each other, that colonialism and that the UK and actually the French were involved when we started drawing lines across the Middle East. But it was a colonial enterprise, and so that was part of what we were trying to get across. On the new audiences and the young people, this is still work in progress. We're not there. We haven't solved it yet. I think what we have done, a bit like we did previously, which is what I was trying to say about trade unions, has make it a priority. And my experience with organising in trade unions is that you do as well on organising as the amount of resources you put into that organisation. So the important thing to do in the first place is decide you want to organise young people, not as an abstract, but as time, money, effort that is going to go into it. The change, I think, that has made this more real, as always, I learned an awful lot about this from my wife, who was running the PSC's social media at the time, Fiona, who's here, was that young people were seeing on social media what was happening and what was going on, and they wanted to know what they could do. So literally on one occasion, the BBC, our famous broadcaster, had put out one of its normal, unbiased reportage of what was going on. And we called a demonstration on the Saturday night. And we had tens of thousands of people outside the BBC on Tuesday shutting the street. And they were all young, because young people were following it. So what we tried to do following that was call meetings through social media to get them to come to events and talk about things, and always make sure that that was the way in which we communicated, that they weren't going to come to our meetings, they weren't going to be interested in committees, they weren't going to get the letters that we sent them, the way we had to talk to them. The other big lesson that we're learning, I think, is that young people are much better at recruiting young people than old people are recruiting old people. However much we try to pretend that we're young and hip, we're not. And it's much better to organise through young people and employing or getting young people to be active. So we're setting up a youth and student committee for them to take responsibility of the organising of young people and to make sure they have a voice in the organisation. Not to do just as we tell them, but to make sure they have a stake in how the organisation runs going forward. And then there's 2 other big resources. Universities through Israel Apartheid Week is one where there are a lot of, there's Palestinian students, there's a lot of international students who are there, there is a resource, there's academics who are there who we can use, and there is a sort of tradition that universities ought to protect freedom of speech, but it will be a battleground as well. But going out to universities, organising meetings and so on is one of the ways that we should try and do it. And what we're trying to do is build a network of young people who are promoting Palestine in their world to go forward. And I mean, my last reference to the fact I've just become a student again after 40 years, one of the things I noticed was that everything is electronic. I don't write an essay. I send it in electronically. I get my essays marked and sent back. Every notice of a lecture is electronic. There is no point in trying to communicate in any other way if you want to communicate with young people. In terms of the UK and trade unions and political parties, it's not dissimilar. I mean, I know we're different, that the political traditions in France of how trade unions organise and political parties is different, but the lesson was the same. We took about 10, 15 years ago a strategic decision that trade unions were our prime target, and we trained our members to raise the issue inside their trade union, inside their branch, to raise Palestine and gradually get resolutions passed, build it up. And there was no other way to do it. It took a long time, union by union, area by area, area by area. It was what we said to our activists: this is the main thing you've got to do. We want you to be organising inside trade unions, working with trade unions, getting to know them and so on. I mean, when I was first a senior official who was on the PSC, I was probably the first senior official in the British trade union movement who spoke up about Palestine. They now don't want to listen to me. They're all talking about Palestine themselves. And that is the sort of process you've got to get going. But it is the hard work. It was the solidarity movement that trained the activists to go, who were in trade unions, to have the confidence to raise the issue. And it's the same we're trying to do in the political party. I mean, the Labour Party has been a target for the supporters of Israel for a long, long time, and we've not been organised, and we're setting about trying to put that right.
Thank you. Rebecca Vilkomerson.
Yeah, just a couple of points to add about organizing young people, and I agree with what Hugh said. I think the first point is around making it a priority, and the other thing is around young people need to be the ones to recruit young people. So when I started as director of JVP 9 years ago, I was the youngest person on staff, and I'm now the oldest. And granted, a lot of time has passed. I am a lot older, but it's also important that most of our staff are, probably at least half our staff are in their 20s, and we have a campus organizer who is a recent college graduate. And it's not just a matter of staff. If you don't have money for staff, that's not the only answer. Before we were doing it that way, we actually had the main thing is to find a small group of people who are willing to, of students and younger people who are willing to work with you. And so we found a very small group of students who actually, and again, it was around an action. We protested Netanyahu at the General Assembly in New Orleans. It was a very bold action where we interrupted 5 times his speech at the Jewish Assembly. We took a video of it. It went completely viral. In conjunction with that, we had something called the Young, Jewish, and Proud Declaration that the students themselves wrote. It was very poetic. It was very beautiful. It was in language different than we would have put it. We had a young artist illustrate it, and it became a poster that became very popular. So it started out from that sort of small, very small group of people. We did this very splashy action. We had something online that we could spread around and become seen as an organization that was welcoming to the leadership of young people, and then started to hire young people to do the other organizing of young people. It does require a certain amount of willingness to change the culture, to change the times. Like this meeting, for example, is during the day on Monday. How could a young person possibly come, right? So you have to have meetings in the evenings. You have to have meetings on the weekends. You have to make sure they are opportunities for leadership, not just to come and sit. And so again, my answer to everything always is to run a good campaign. So right now, our students came up with their own campaign, which is called Return the Birthright. So they're focusing specifically on birthright trips, which I'm sure you've all heard of. I think they run, I don't know if they run here also, yeah. But that's something that students are specifically recruited for on campuses, and so it's something that specifically affects them, and so they're doing this campus by campus, but also joint campaign to get students to question the premise behind birthright, behind right of return, to think about the Nakba, to think about the discriminatory nature of the trips, and to have their individual campuses not accept them anymore. And so it's a student-run campaign, it's a student-led campaign, and a student-driven campaign, and so and we're just watching it happen, and it's very successful. So yeah, there has to be a willingness, I think, to turn over leadership, to give resources, and to have a willingness to change the culture. And actually, one of the things that I think is greatest about JVP right now is that it's truly intergenerational, and there's a mutual respect between the generations. Again, that sounds a little utopian. It's not like that all the time. We annoy each other sometimes. It's not always perfect, but overwhelmingly, we have a sense of appreciation both for the young energy and for the wisdom of older people who have been through many movements before, and I think that brings us a lot of strength.
Thank you. Quelques autres questions, monsieur?
I'm sorry that there is no mic. I think the woman is talking about the time that we are behind schedule, but I'm not sure because, once again, we do not hear what is being said.
Partie de l'Union juive française.
So I'm part of the FP, and I just have two questions for Rebecca to better understand the history of the Jewish community in the United States. You have successfully engaged many young Jewish people in the United States, but in France is very complicated. So what is the specificity about the United States on that point? And then the relationship to religion seems to be a little bit different in the United States, in that in France there are much more Zionists in people practicing religion. And to conclude, I just want to inform everybody that tomorrow evening we will have a public meeting with Rebecca and the UGFP and the AFPS, Salle Gendarme in the 2nd arrondissement of Paris. Thank you.
Madame.
I am from the Netherlands, from a different Jewish voice, and I would like to pose a question to Rebecca Vilkomerson. Rebecca, you mentioned two things, that in 2015 you went full on BDS, and the other thing you said was that you are trying to entice the mainstream community, mainstream Jews in the United States to come to you. How much was BDS a factor for people to run away from Jewish Voice for Peace or to be attracted to Jewish Voice for Peace?
So Rebecca Vilkomerson.
Well, I can certainly combine the answers to those questions because they're very related. And yes, thank you for the little advertisement for my talk tomorrow. I'm very excited about it. I hope folks will come because there was so much about this morning's conversation about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the relation to the state of Israel and to white supremacy that I would have liked to have talked about, and I think we'll talk much more about that tomorrow. So I hope folks will come who are interested to hear more about it. Meanwhile, briefly, again, the Jewish community in the United States, I'm not that familiar with the Jewish community here. I don't know for sure that it's necessarily more in the organized Jewish community. In the United States also is extremely Zionist. And that's actually, I think, one of the reasons it is actually important to be having a discussion about anti-Zionism and non-Zionism, and to remember the histories of the fact that for a long time Zionism was a minority viewpoint in the Jewish community, and actually we should be reclaiming some of that history. And that, so we're very proud. We don't actually have a position on Zionism in Jewish Voice for Peace. It's something we're talking about, but we want to remind people we have many members who are very proud anti-Zionists, who are very proud non-Zionists. We have a few people who are post-Zionists. We have a few people who don't care what they're called, who don't want to talk about it at all. We have probably a few people who might call themselves Buber Zionists or Judah-Magnus Zionists. But the point is that we want to sort of remind people that Zionism was not always so intimately connected to Judaism, and you can be Jewish in many, many different ways, and Zionism needs to be disconnected from that, so we're very proud to have that range of membership. I think the thing that's interesting about the Jewish community, I mean, there's so much I could say about it. I'm trying to think of how to be brief. Of course, in the United States, there's more than one stream of Zionism. So there's Reconstructionist and Reform and Conservative, which are the sort of more within American society, like the more, and also the modern Orthodox. But then there's a rather large Orthodox community which holds itself separate, which we have no inroads into at all. And so most of our membership is more in those other more less strict, let's say, streams, but also we have a large membership of people who are not connected at all religiously, that they're secular Jewish, or they're historically Jewish, or they're culturally Jewish, and we're not at all, and there's a portion of our membership that cares about religion and about observance, and there's a portion of our membership that cares about it not at all. We have no feelings about any of that, or I guess our feelings are that we welcome everybody, and in fact, it's also very important to us because there's so much intermarriage in the United States that we don't define Jewishness, and we're not recreating the sort of Jewish exclusivity that the Israeli state relies upon in our membership. So there are many people who are related to Judaism through marriage or through other parts of their family. We also have members, we say we're an organization inspired by Jewish tradition. If there are non-Jewish people who want to work under that framework, they're very, very welcome, and we have some people in the organization who are leaders in that respect, and so we have a very broad point of view. It's actually interesting about young people, since people were interested about young people. When JVP began, it was begun by an older generation of more secular people who were already on the left, and decided that it was important to speak out from a place of Jewish identity on this topic in particular. I'm of course generalizing hugely. As we began to attract more young people, many of the young people that we attracted, especially up until 2014, were people who were more Jewish religiously. They had a Jewish practice, and they didn't need Israel so much, and they didn't need Zionism so much, because if you grew up a secular Jew and all you knew about your Jewishness was the Holocaust in Israel, and the Holocaust and Holocaust in Israel, which was much of the way that people were brought up, then Israel was your only link to your Jewishness, and so it was very hard to let go of. For people who had have a strong sense of Jewish observance in other ways, much easier to call yourself non-Zionist or anti-Zionist because you have a strong Jewish practice. In terms of the BDS call, we went through a very long democratic process to decide whether to take on the BDS call. It went on for several years. Interestingly, in the intervening years, people already associated us very much with the BDS movement, so all the sort of fears that we had about it having some huge impact and driving people away were completely irrelevant, because people already saw us as a BDS organization quite correctly, I have to say. We were an organization that did certain types of BDS campaigns and also defended the BDS movement and said it wasn't anti-Semitic. Not in every case, of course, but it was not necessarily anti-Semitic to pursue BDS campaigns against Israel. So it turned out to be a move that enabled more people to come towards us, and very importantly for our allies to bring us into a full feeling of trust, and that's very important. We care about the Jewish community, but we also care very much about our allies, especially our Palestinian and Muslim and Arab allies, and so it was something important for them that we endorsed the call, and it was very important for us to be able to build those relationships to have done that. And I will say it's been especially important after 2014, the Gaza war, that of course, we want to attract also what we call progressives accept Palestine, so people who are slightly to our right, who are liberal on every issue except for on Israel. And those are the people that are actually harder to reach because they're already in other communities and it's much harder for them to leave them. But the ways that we've grown the fastest is by attracting what we call unaffiliated Jews. And those are largely the more radical Jews who have not been part of any Jewish institution because they're alienated by the fact that they're being asked to leave their politics at the door and that they can't be part of these institutions unless they don't speak about Israel and about Palestinian rights. And by creating a space where they can be both, they are actually suddenly becoming actively Jewish, reborn Jewish to a certain way. Which there's lots of conversations within the Jewish community about Jewish continuity, and I always say to those people that we're very much contributing to it because we're making it possible for some people to become involved with a Jewish organization like JVP when they were alienated before.
Merci infiniment. Je crois qu'effectivement, le temps qui nous était imparti.
Thank you very much. It is now 4:28 p.m. Thank you very much to each one of you. Thank you for being here and thank you for your contributions.